Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I am Jeff Rosen, and this is my second week on the job as the new president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. I cannot imagine an evening event that I would rather be introducing during my first full time on the job than this one. We have here a superb panel of panelists tonight. They are the top scholars in the country about the Civil War. Many are close friends as well. I think you are about to have an intellectual discussion. I think I'll even call it a constitutional conversation that we won't soon forget. The center is all about constitutional conversations. Each time you come here, I want you to experience the best arguments on all sides of our historical and contemporary constitutional debates and make up your own mind. And I really can't imagine people better equipped to be part of that conversation. This wonderful event is sponsored by the New York Times' superb Disunion blog. And I have to welcome one of the editors of the Disunion blog, my old friend and New Republic colleague, Clay Risen, who's sitting here in the front row and is now at the New York Times. The Disunion blog describes itself in this way. It says, 150 years ago, Americans went to war with themselves. Disunion revisits and reconsiders America's most perilous period using contemporary accounts, diaries, images, and historical assessments to follow the Civil War as it unfolded. For those of you who haven't followed it, first of all, go to your tablets and computers as soon as you get home and pull it up. But as Clay was explaining, it started as an experiment. It wasn't clear to the editors that there'd be enough material to sustain an audience, so it was supposed to take a discrete period of time and basically, day by day, track the events that occurred 150 years ago during the Civil War. And it's proved such a success that it's been extended not only to Fort Sumter, but to the entire Civil War period. And tonight we have the great pleasure of reviewing the pivotal battles and events leading up to one of the Civil War's bloodiest conflicts, the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the 150th anniversary of Gettysburg, as you know. That'll be celebrated, or at least marked, with great solemnity in November with a series of events here at the Constitution Center and certainly on the Disunion blog. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Civil War. Not the bloodiest, that would have been Antietam, at which 17,000 men died, 23,000 dead or wounded. The bloodiest day in American history. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the future Supreme Court Justice, wounded through the neck at Antietam, one of 3 wounds he received, and changed his view of the Constitution forever. But Gettysburg was, next to Antietam, one of the bloodiest conflicts. In addition to the hard-fought Union victory, the battle, of course, yielded Lincoln's iconic Gettysburg Address, which connected the sacrifices of the Civil War with America's founding ideals of freedom. And in our conversation tonight, I've told our panelists that the one rule of coming to the Constitution Center is that you have to take place in a constitutional conversation. We have to connect the historical events to our constitutional debates, and they are going to examine some of the constitutional controversies arising out of the Civil War, including Lincoln's controversial suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which I think that some of them may try to persuade you was not actually as bad, or at least as constitutionally adventurous as you may have been led to believe. In addition to this great event, we have a series of events marking the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. I hope that you'll view the Emancipation and Its Legacies panel show, which we have on display downstairs. From July 25th to September 22nd, I'm delighted to announce the center will display a copy of a rare printing of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln. This is one of only 26 copies signed by Lincoln that remain in existence today. This fall, I hope you'll come back to experience the expanded Civil War section of our main exhibition, including artifacts and content highlighting the Battle of Gettysburg. And since I can't resist a plug for this exciting event, starting next spring, we'll be preparing another iconic document which you'll be able to view the following fall, and that is one of the 12 surviving copies of the original ratification copies of the Bill of Rights. George Washington sent 13 out plus one to the federal government. Only 12 remain in existence, and the National Constitution Center will display one of those starting in early 2014. I will now briefly introduce our extraordinarily distinguished panelists and our moderator and turn it over to them. Our panelists include my old friend and extremely distinguished author, Adam Goodheart, director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College, and author of the New York Times best-selling book, 1861, The Civil War Awakening. And next, we have another old friend and New Republic colleague, one of America's most preeminent historians, Sean Wilentz. He is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton, where he's taught since 1979. Among many books, he's written The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln. And he's a longtime contributing editor, not only at the New Republic, where I've written for a long time, but also writes regularly for the New York Times and the London Times. And another new friend who I'm just so delighted to welcome to the center, Judith Giesberg, an associate professor of history at Villanova, author of 2 books on the Civil War, and the associate editor for book reviews for the Journal of the Civil War, and editor of the popular magazine Civil War Monitor. And as our moderator, we are so happy and pleased to welcome Ted Widmer. He is the former director of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, one of America's most important centers for research into early American history. He writes often for the New York Times. He is the author of several books, and he served as a foreign policy speechwriter and senior advisor to Bill Clinton. You can meet all of our panelists after the show in the lobby, where they will be introducing and launching their new Disunion book, which I know that they will be delighted to sign for you. And finally, before I welcome the guests, I'll note that they will talk among themselves and give us their thoughts and have a great conversation. We will have time for audience questions. Please write down your questions on the note cards that you received at registration and give your cards to the people who will be walking up and down the aisles. And finally, it is impossible to have a constitutional conversation without silencing your cell phones, so please do that and make sure they're all properly turned off. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Goodheart, Sean Wilentz, Judith Giesberg, and Ted Widmer. Ladies and gentlemen, here they are. Take it away, Ted.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And on behalf of the panelists, we'd like to say how happy we are to be here so soon in your tenure, and I'm sure it will be a very successful one. I want to welcome all of you. Thanks for coming out to what is effectively our book party. Clay Risen, who was introduced, helped to bring this book into fruition, but it came into fruition through journalism, through what is often called the first draft of history, the writing of accounts in newspaper format, or in this case, an online newspaper format. And I just want to mention George Kalogerakis, Clay's co-editor of the blog. Couldn't be with us tonight, but he sends his best regards. And it's lovely to be back at the National Constitution Center. I was Adam Goodhart's forerunner as the director of the C.V. Starr Center in Maryland. And in 2001, I was brand new in that position. I was given a tour of this facility, and it was then largely a hole in the ground. Some of you may remember there was a kind of void waiting to be filled in, and you have filled it in magnificently. And that basically is the job before all of us who love history, how to fill in the knowledge of the past. And I still can't stop thinking about the 1968 exhibit. Jeff just kindly gave me and the panelists a tour of it, and I'm having a kind of traumatic recall of an event in 1968. I was 5 years old, and my parents cared a lot about that election. And it was very important to choose the right candidate, but I was only 5, and it was a little hard for me to separate Richard Nixon from Hubert Humphrey. And my kindergarten class, which was on a military base in Taiwan, took a straw poll of the 5-year-olds, and I knew that either we were really for Richard Nixon or really against him. And I voted for him. I cast my first vote for Richard Nixon, and I came back and told my father, and he was absolutely horrified. So I tried to claim voter fraud the next day, and I didn't get very far with it. Well, we're going to try to fill in a little bit of the void in our collective knowledge of the Civil War, and it's not an easy challenge because so much is known about the Civil War. It's a conflict that we live with. We certainly study it in school, but it's a kind of historical event that we feel strong emotions about also. Robert Penn Warren, in an essay a little over a half century ago, said it's our most keenly felt history. Americans know this story in their bones, and we relive it. We relive it in our pop culture. We relive it in Southern rock songs. We relive it in the battles over curricula and State House displays of flags that come up every now and then. It's a war we will never stop living with. And we even learn the raw data in new ways now and then. Only a year ago, we learned that our previous understanding, a long fact that was held to be certain, the number of people killed in the Civil War, was upgraded a year ago from about 640,000 to 750,000 based on some new data. And the new data never stops. And because so much, in addition to the carnage wrought by the war, there was a great deal of reflection on the war by its participants, by the people living in the towns who sent their loved ones into the conflict. And we still, with the great revolution in printing and reading that is still happening in the last generation, we are still unearthing new evidence of the conflict. And with all of these thoughts in mind, a couple of years ago, Clay and George of the New York Times began to think about a new way of telling the story of the Civil War. The Times has a unique voice. It's read by millions of people around the world on a daily basis, and it has a great responsibility to tell the story, to give us all the news that's fit to print, including all the news about the past that it can choose to print. And George and Clay, working in an obscure corner of the opinion desk, decided that they would use a part of the paper's real estate, the online feature known as the Opinionator, which, because it's online, you can only read it online. It doesn't exist in the printed New York Times, to begin to get at the story of the Civil War in some new ways. And we wanted to tell the story following the conceit of what happened 150 years ago on this day. And we will hear a lot about this from our three panelists. And if you're from Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, you probably should be a little scared right now because as we are about to hear, Pennsylvania is going to come into the crosshairs of this conflict in a very visceral way in just a few weeks. Clay and I can't stop thinking about what happened 150 years ago as if it's happening right now. So you'll forgive us if we go into the present tense. And we wanted to put history online in an immediate way. We wanted to make the writing of history open to a lot of different kinds of people, including non-academics. We wanted to tell stories of people who hadn't been in the history books previously. We wanted to use visual effects. We wanted to get into mapping and art and tell the story from as many perspectives as we could. And we thought we might let it go 1 or 2 years at the most, and the series has been so electrifying to us as editors, and I think to the people writing for it, and I hope to the readers as well, that we're now going all the way through the entire Civil War, and we're only midway through, but at this midway point, we've decided to publish the book that is available for purchase, and I hope you will consider purchasing it. And so it's been an experiment in the writing of history generally, as well as in trying to seek new knowledge about the Civil War. I thank you all for coming out tonight, and I applaud the NCC for its breadth of vision, because of course, we're a little out of the formative period of the creation of the Constitution, but the Civil War was, among many other things, a profound constitutional crisis, and we will get into that tonight. So Jeff introduced our three panelists, but I will say briefly that Sean will situate us politically. He's going to talk about what the war felt like from a political perspective at this time 150 years ago. Adam Goodheart will then talk about the cultural perspective, what it felt like to be living in the North, perhaps the South as well. And then Judy will bring it home to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and talk about some of the people she's been working on and their sense of how the war was progressing day to day. So without further ado, let me introduce Sean Wilentz. Thank you.
Can I get up there?
Sorry?
Can I get up there? So I can hear?
That's fine.
Okay. I'll sit down. I'm the old guy in this panel. I was not 5 years old in 1968. And it really brought back, you really ought to see that. I mean, especially I can see enough gray hair in this room. It will bring you right back in an instant, and it's shocking. And the 1860s were just as shocking as the 1960s. Has everyone got one of these? Philadelphia Inquirer from June 16th and June 17th, 1863? Do look at them. Don't read them carefully now. In fact, if you can read them.
You can't.
No, but just look at the headlines and you get a sense in the map and you get a sense of what's going on. I mean, the Civil War is written about so much because it is the central event in American history, and without question. One of my colleagues once said that if anything happened that either cannot help you explain why the Civil War happened or what the Civil War meant, it doesn't matter. It's that important. It also has inspired some of the greatest literature, some of the greatest historical literature, some of the greatest literature, and a lot of bad stuff too. Really bad stuff. The worst stuff about American history is usually written in the Civil War. And so our job is to clean that stuff up, in part. I won't be doing any of that tonight, though. My job here, and I'm really delighted to be here with so many old friends. Gosh, it's terrific. But I was especially happy to be asked to contribute a piece to the Disunion series. So I'm going to give you some background before we get more specific. I'm going to read this mostly because I have some quotations in it. On June 17, 1863, 150 years ago tonight, an audience like this in Philadelphia would have been very confused and pretty jittery. General Robert E. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania was underway, and it was commonly assumed that if successful, Lee would almost certainly, at least in time, if not take this city, then menace it. But reports from the front lines were unclear. Quote, this is from the paper you've got in front of you. It is hard to discriminate in the conflict and confusion of the news, which is the true view of the case, the Inquirer reported. One statement speaks of the enemy being 10,000 strong. Oof. And another of a force advancing in 6 columns, which conveys an idea of even larger units. In fact, Lee's main unit was 75,000 strong. Today we'll probably clear up some of the causes of doubt and apprehension. Let us all, however, rally promptly to the aid of the state and for the good of the great cause. And above all things, let us avoid panic. Philadelphians, compared to most Pennsylvanians, were proving stalwart in their support of the Union. Local peace Democrats were opposed to the war, actually quite sympathetic to the South and sympathetic to slavery, many of them. They denounced the war all the time, attacking not least, and in very vicious ways, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which of course had been signed on January 1st. But these Democrats were unpopular in Philadelphia, and they were becoming increasingly so. In the elections back in 1862, just like our elections, back in the fall, it wasn't a presidential election then, it was a congressional, a midterm election. Philadelphia had voted pretty heavily Republican. There were some fresh difficulties. There was a new orders by Secretary of War Stanton about the terms for enlistment from here on in, and they were pretty strict, and people didn't like them. And so there would have been a rush to enlist when Lee's invasion was first reported, and then people that trickled away. But with the Confederates on their way, Philadelphia was far less alienated and far more loyal than a certain metropolis 150 miles or so north of here. We'll get to that later. More than 2 years into a titanic struggle that both sides initially thought would be over in a matter of weeks with little loss of life, the war was taking a deep, deep toll. Although overall, by this point, the Confederacy had more reasons for confidence than the Union did on this night 150 years ago. After the Battle of Antietam, which was mentioned the bloodiest day in American history, through the winter of 1862 and 63, and then on into the spring, Robert E. Lee had triumphed in one major battle after another, capped by his astounding victory at Chancellorsville in early May, in which he defeated a force twice the size of his own, commanded by Joseph Hooker. one of the proceedings of failed Union generals until Grant. The victory had been very costly. 13,000 Confederate casualties, 22% of their entire force, with the greatest loss being that of Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was killed from wounds inflicted by friendly fire. Yet so long were the odds, and so smashing was the result at Chancellorsville, that morale among Lee's troops reached the highest level of the entire war. "My God," President Lincoln moaned when he received news of the outcome in the State Department telegraph office. "What will the country say?" Lee himself had come to regard his army as invincible, and so in mid-May he persuaded President Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederate High Command to approve a really high-risk scheme that, if successful, would almost certainly lead to the Union's capitulation. Well, as Lincoln's words of despair showed, the Union's mood was correspondingly low. While the war in the Eastern Theater was going poorly, General Grant, commanding the Western forces, was having a very tough time at Vicksburg. The Northern problems were not confined to the battlefield. Although the Republicans still controlled a majority in the House of Representatives, thanks to a convenient alliance with pro-war Democrats, the party had lost heavily in those fall elections, which was widely interpreted as a repudiation of Lincoln's policies. With their majority, the Republicans managed to continue a quiet, but nevertheless revolutionary shift in the locus of federal power, passing both a new Banking Act and, in March 1863, a Conscription Act. But these actions only further inflamed Northern opinion. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary version of which the president had released before the fall elections, which helps account for the Republicans' debacle, was proving more unpopular than expected, as previous sympathetic loyalists reneged at the explicit transformation of a war for the Union into a war to abolish slavery. In the Western states, so-called Copperhead politicians, led by former Congressman from Ohio, Clement Vallandigham, we had a conversation about how to pronounce that, Clement Vallandigham were making public statements so provocative, not least for the overtones of inciting desertion from the Union Army, that some considered them seditious. On May 1st, this Vallandigham, now running for the state governorship and looking to cause a blow-up, gave a fiery speech at Mount Vernon, Ohio, that was calculated to upset the commander of the Department of Ohio, General Ambrose Burnside. Soon thereafter, Burnside's men arrested the Copperhead, and on May 6th ordered him imprisoned for the war's duration. A military commission ordered him imprisoned for the war's duration. Thence began an outcry over alleged violations of civil rights, constitutional civil liberties, that has resounded to this day, permanently besmirching in some quarters President Lincoln's reputation and further dividing in 1863 the Union cause. The Confederates, to be sure, had their troubles too. It wasn't that everything was going great for them. It included a recent wave of bread riots in Richmond, led by women who had been left to starve along with their children, as the Confederate government tried its best to keep its army's body and soul together. But in the middle of June 1863, the combination of General Robert E. Lee and Northern disaffection seemed on the brink of bringing the Confederates a breakthrough that might finally secure their independence as a nation with the first pro-slavery constitution in the history of the world.
Thanks, Sean. And thank you to Jeff Rosen and the National Constitution Center for inviting us here, and also to Clay Risen and his colleagues at the New York Times for the great adventure of the Disunion series. It felt for a while, especially in the first year of the series, I felt sort of like I was addicted to writing for that series for a while, addicted to living in the 1860s. And I went back recently, I counted up that I'd written 73 pieces in that first year, which sort of made me feel like I really was addicted to it. But as Ted just mentioned, we just went through, Jeff kindly took us through the wonderful exhibition on 1968. Have many of you seen that? Here, it's just fantastic. And as I went through it, I couldn't help but feel a sense of deja vu, or almost sort of double deja vu, as we went through and we saw the military apparatus from Vietnam and these TVs that were old vintage TVs blaring Walter Cronkite's reports from the Tet Offensive in 1968. And as I looked at this, it seemed like I was also maybe looking at another 60s moment, the 1860s moment, when violence suddenly seemed to explode out of the heart of our country, when old dogmas and old institutions seemed to be crumbling almost overnight, and when new freedoms seemed to be springing up equally quickly, and also when new media were bringing these developments, bringing war into people's homes, into their living rooms in a way that they had never been seen before. And in fact, now that I mention it, perhaps in some ways there are similarities to our own time as well. So as Sean said, if you look at an example of this new media that Judy Giesberg was kind enough to bring, and that all of you have that front page of the Inquirer, my hometown paper, by the way, from June 17th, 1863. This is a newspaper that is unlike anything that you would have seen if you had picked up an American newspaper just 10 or 20, let alone 30 years before. These headlines that scream out from the front page, the maps, the dispatches that came by telegraph, all of these brought a kind of immediacy of politics and immediacy of war and of the news itself to people around the country in a way that could never have been experienced before. For instance, in 1775, when at Lexington was fired, of course, the famous shot heard round the world. Well, they call it the shot heard round the world, but it took months for that shot even to echo around the American colonies, let alone around the world. Whereas you can see in 1863, all that had changed. The telegraph, cheap printing, new engraving techniques brought the war, not just verbally, but also visually, onto people's breakfast tables. So you can see that this main headline in the Inquirer sort of screams the news. I mean, almost like, I don't know, Bill O'Reilly style or something like that. Just deck after deck of rally, Pennsylvania invaded, the people coming to the rescue, followed by, I counted, a 17-deck headline. Amazing. And then a little bit further down, you see a line of much finer print that strikes shame into my heart, which is the line, Philadelphia has not responded. Sorry. But in fact, the panic, as Sean suggested, was spreading across much of Pennsylvania. Harrisburg was being evacuated, bank deposits were being removed, state archives were being moved to Philly, and intrepid volunteers were digging trenches around the city of Pittsburgh, if not Philly. The roads of southern Pennsylvania were crammed with carriages and wagons of people trying to escape. Now, meanwhile, down in Washington, D.C., where the President of the United States and his cabinet, just like other Americans, were trying to follow this news by any means possible and through these new technologies, a member of Lincoln's cabinet, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, who was also quite an active diarist during the Civil War, that evening, June 17th, exactly 150 years ago, he went down to the War Department, which was where the telegraph office was housed. I think those of you who saw the movie Lincoln remember that scene in the telegraph office, wonderful scene. And Lincoln and Secretary Stanton were there, as they were on many nights and days during the war. And these rumors were coming in from all sides, and Welles was quite worried. But when he went into the telegraph office, immediately a sort of a jovial Stanton assured him that it was all false rumors, that the rebels hadn't even entered Pennsylvania yet. And Welles also wrote in his diary that night, the president was in excellent humor. And Lincoln was talking all about how, in fact, this alleged invasion of Pennsylvania, was going to be fodder for his favorite comedian, his favorite writer of political satire. No sooner did Lincoln get on the subject of comedy than he started telling his favorite McClellan joke that he just heard, which was something about a monkey and a snake that I didn't really get, so I won't tell it now. But anyway, clearly in Washington they were, to say the least, misinformed. Meanwhile, in the field, the Army wasn't much better off. That same day, General Hooker, who was commanding the Army of the Potomac, at least for the next few days, wrote to Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief, and asked Halleck, back in Washington, what's going on? What's Lee up to? And Halleck writes back to Hooker later that same day, so far, we have only the wild rumors of panic-stricken people. That was all they had. Clearly, the military intelligence at this time was lacking. But in fact, there was reason for people to be panicking, especially, as Sean mentioned, in the north, where the Union armies in Virginia were deep into their third unsuccessful summer campaign of the war, and morale was seriously flagging for many reasons. There had been huge anti-war rallies, including in New York at the Cooper Union just a couple of weeks earlier. And people were saying terrible things in this press, in this new media of the 1860s, terrible things, not just about the Confederates, but about the Union leaders. On June 17th, there was one newspaper that wrote, "The Tsar of Russia or the Emperor of Austria never claimed or exercised more unlimited powers than King Lincoln." And this was a newspaper, I might add, not in one of the border slave states where you might expect it, but a newspaper in Maine, deep as you can get into Yankeedom. And there's news also from even farther afield, overseas, that's a bit discouraging. For instance, that month, the French troops were sweeping through Mexico on their way to topple the Mexican government in Mexico City and soon to set up this Habsburg puppet emperor on the throne. So there was a feeling that this whole fabric of freedom, not just in the United States, but in the Americas, was sort of unraveling all over. This invasion that had happened because, of course, the United States was seen as too powerless to enforce the Monroe Doctrine in the middle of its crisis. Now, meanwhile, all of these headlines from across the North were being followed by one very wily Southerner, Mr. Robert E. Lee, who was a general who, I think it's not always appreciated, understood not just the power of the sword, but also the power of the pen, or you might say the power of these new high-speed printing presses, the new journalism and the telegraph that was carrying the news, carrying rumor, and carrying, as we see, panic faster than ever before. Lee, I think, understood that a propaganda war indeed was being fought, and that it was this war, as much as the war on the battlefields, that was important for the South to win. I think Lee understood something that we sort of forget today. Looking through our hindsight, our vision from 150 years later, and we know how the Civil War, you do know that the South lost the Civil War, right? Okay, I don't want to spoil anything. Knowing how the Civil War turned out and that the South lost, we tend to think of them as the underdog. But in fact, the Confederacy had a much easier job, had in some ways an upper hand over the Union, because, of course, the Union needed to win the war, to destroy the political and military apparatus of the Confederate rebellion. The Confederacy didn't need to destroy the Union. The Confederacy didn't need to, in a sense, win the war. The Confederacy simply had to not lose the war. So every month and every year that Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the others could hang on, they were ever closer to victory, almost no matter what was happening on the battlefield. And Lee was planning a sort of a two-pronged propaganda attack. And I really think he was thinking about propaganda as much as of military victory. He was planning, on the one hand, that this invasion of Pennsylvania would deal a final mortal blow to Union morale. At the same time, he was urging President Jefferson Davis to open up peace negotiations with the Lincoln administration, sort of leading them on to think that the Confederacy was proposing a plan of honorable reunion, but actually thinking, well, once these negotiations are underway and we've won this victory in the North, the Unionists will really lose heart and will really be, they'll really be ready to capitulate. So this is the battle that was being fought besides the battle that would be decided on the field. And of course, the moment of truth as of June 17th was less than 2 weeks away.
Judy?
Judy?
So thank you. I'll add my thank yous to everybody else's thank yous for having us all here. And for some of you who've been reading the blog, thank you for reading it and adding your comments. It's been a really great way to interact with people and in a very immediate way. So my job is, as I understand it, is to sort of take us to a sort of microscopic level and talk about, I want to talk in particular about one Philadelphian who experienced the war, because that's something that I've been working on. And I think it helps us to understand Philadelphia, the experience of Philadelphians in the war. So for about a year and a half now, I've been working with a group of graduate students at Villanova to transcribe and annotate a diary of a young African-American woman who lived in Philadelphia during the Civil War. Her name is Emily Davis. Her name was. I'm also seem to be living in the 1860s too. It's an unusual source, and we first became interested in it because the first diary that still exists, whether or not it's her first one, we don't know, begins on January 1st, 1863, the day the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect. So as we started to read the diary, we found that despite this presidential proclamation, what the diary was teaching us was that emancipation was really an open question, even after the proclamation came into effect. In Emily's diary, her faith in emancipation rises and falls with Lincoln's political future, and really with the fate of the Union Army. And I think that that's not necessarily news for people, but it reminds you that for people of color, in living in the North during the Civil War, they were keenly interested in the outcome of emancipation. And clearly for people, those people who were actively seeking their freedom in the South, people of color in the South who were seeking their freedom, emancipation wasn't a done deal. There's not one day during the war when they felt like it was effectively over, and we get that sense even from a free black woman living in Philadelphia. Every day, it's a different trial for her. She has to be reminded, she has to remind herself that we're in the process. The emancipation is this process. Each day we read her diary, she's either worried or joyful. She's either celebrating the fate of emancipation or she's worried about the fate of emancipation, and sometimes she does that in the same day. She's reading the newspapers along with everybody else in Philadelphia, and the news is coming pretty fast by the end of the war, so she can find several editions of the Philadelphia Inquirer by the time at the end of the war, so she can have those different emotions within one given day. What is fascinating about this source, and many of the sources I think that have been highlighted on the Disunion blog, is that you really get the raw immediacy of the events. Lived through the eyes of someone who doesn't know the outcome of them. And it's really exhilarating, and I hope some of you who've been reading the blog have got that experience too. The people who are producing these documents that are being profiled in the blog, they don't know how it's going to come out. And certainly this diarist who I've been working on doesn't. I wanted to read, just to get a sense of how Philadelphians like Emily Davis are experiencing the war, I wanted to read just a couple of her diary entries for starting today and for the next couple of weeks, so we can get a sense of what it felt like on the ground in Philadelphia starting tonight and going forward until the end of the Gettysburg campaign. If you want to read the rest of the diary, you can go to www.davisdiaries.villanova.edu. You can read the whole diary and you can live it through her eyes. So I'll start with a couple of these diary entries, and then I'll talk about those a little bit more. There are really two things that Emily Davis is most worried about in starting mid-June through till the end of the Gettysburg campaign, and that is the Confederates who are invading the state and the safety of her relatives who live not only in Philadelphia, but also in Harrisburg and other locales that would be in the line of potentially come in contact with the Confederates. And the second thing that she's most interested in is black enlistment, because she is attending a black school in Philadelphia where many of the young men are attempting to enlist. And we can see these things highlighted in her diary. So I'll just give you a little flavor of this diary. Tuesday, June 23rd, 1863, Emily attends school and a meeting, and she writes in her diary, "I feel so worried about father." And Emily's father lives in Harrisburg. Monday, June 29th, 1863, Emily wrote a letter to her father and then wrote in her diary, "Today has been a most exciting day. I have witnessed refugees are coming in from all towns this side of Harrisburg." Tuesday, June 30th, 1863, Emily writes, "The greatest excitement prevails. I am most sick worrying about father. The city is considered in danger." Wednesday, July 1st, the first day of fighting in the little town of Gettysburg, doesn't go well for the Union Army. Emily doesn't even mention Gettysburg, but it's there in her thoughts with everything she says. This is what she writes in her diary that day. "The excitement is not quite so great today. Vincent is perfectly wild with excitement. All the boys have volunteered." So in those couple of diary entries that you've seen, what's foremost in her mind, and for many Black Philadelphians like her who have families, members of their family who live elsewhere in the state or even in Philadelphia, they're concerned about the safety of their family members. Black communities are intimately familiar by this time with what invasion meant. They had been fending off what had been a long invasion that by 1861 they had been engaged with slave catchers. They had been defending white Philadelphians, and white Pennsylvanians had been defending their Black neighbors from kidnapping really since the 1830s. This is a really long history by the time the war begins, and this is not news to anybody who's living along any Black Pennsylvanians living along the southern border. They're used to engaging with slave catchers. But they're also keenly worried about this new invasion and what it will mean for the safety of their families. So when residents of South Central Pennsylvania read news, like you see in your newspaper there, that the Confederates are heading toward the border, they might have anticipated what would happen next. They knew probably before anybody else knew that meant that the Confederates were going to be taking people back into slavery. They were going to be kidnapping African Americans and bringing them into slavery. And we don't know how many Black Pennsylvanians were taken during the Gettysburg campaign. Historians estimate somewhere between 200 and 300 Black Pennsylvanians simply disappear during the weeks that the Confederate Army is making their appearance in Pennsylvania, and they're either imprisoned or sold. But many more of them flee their homes. And we can see this in the newspaper article that you have. I think it's one of them mentions Harrisburg. There's a Harrisburg letter on June 17th. If you have really good eyes, you can see the headline in the middle, "Our Harrisburg Letter." From Harrisburg, they start to hear about refugees, people who are fleeing the advancing Confederate Army, taking whatever they could, leaving their homes, trying to go to Harrisburg, or later on during the month, winding up in the streets of Philadelphia. People with just a few personal belongings on them, who knew that or felt like they would be safer in Philadelphia than they would be standing in the way of Lee's army. For Black Pennsylvanians, what's fascinating about this, when you live the Civil War on a day-by-day basis, Gettysburg is not a 3-day battle. It's really a 3-week-long saga when they're nervous about what the outcome will be and which of their family members they might not ever see again. So her first consideration, or her first concern, Emily Davis's, is for the security of people of color in the state of Pennsylvania. Her second interest, and the thing that shows up in these 3 weeks that she's writing about the Gettysburg campaign, is Black enlistment. On Monday, June 15th, Emily wrote a letter to her brother, who was serving in the US Navy by this point, visited friends, and then she wrote in her diary, "I saw a company of colored recruits. They looked quite warlike," she says. And then on Tuesday, June 16th, She writes about all of her friends who are enlisting, and she's worried about them. She doesn't know what that means, all of them. Does that mean her friends? Does that mean her colleagues, her teachers at her school? And then on June 18th, when about 150 men of color from Philadelphia got on trains and went to Harrisburg to volunteer to defend the state, among them Octavius Cato, who some of you probably have heard. Emily writes in her diary, "Today has been the most exciting day I ever witnessed." And you can see that a lot. Every day is the most exciting day because it just gets more exciting each day. We went to see the boys start for Harrisburg, she writes. "I left home about 11 o'clock. It was almost 12 in the morning when I came home." Then on Friday, June 19th, she writes, "The first thing I heard was that the boys had been sent back. I feel glad and sorry." And that last line, of course, means when the men showed up in Harrisburg, they were turned back because the state of Pennsylvania still did not accept black recruits. Ironically, right, the Confederate Army is coming into the state. They're desperate to get people to defend the state. Philadelphians don't seem to be worried about defending the state. And black Philadelphians who do come out to volunteer are turned away. So what do we learn from Emily Davis's diary entries about black recruitment? Well, for starters, what we learn is that she's up late at night, she's attending meetings, she's watching men drill, she's worried about people's safety. Those are things that are common for all diarists writing during the war. And it's, of course, deeply frustrating, too. You can imagine for her friends and her colleagues, her family members who are trying to enlist. Massachusetts, a lot of you, I'm sure know, you saw the movie Glory, right? Massachusetts accepted black men into regiments starting in January. They started enrolling black men as Union soldiers. Pennsylvania wouldn't do so until after the Gettysburg invasion was over. Right? Ironically, by the end of June, Philadelphia is a nexus for black enlistment, with not only Camp William Penn out in Cheltenham, Massachusetts, but also the school for training the white officers of black troops right on Chestnut. That's where that school was. So you sort of see that startling change within those few weeks of the Gettysburg campaign. Black men churn out, they go to Harrisburg, they're sent back by Governor Curtin, but by the end of June, Philadelphia is a really important part of black recruitment. Of course, as those black recruits head out to Harrisburg and are turned back, the famous Massachusetts 54th, it's on its way to South Carolina, where it will eventually make its stand at Fort Wagner, which is what is featured so prominently in the movie Glory. So what has been interesting about reading this source and a lot of the other sources, as I mentioned, is that you get a sense of none of this being predetermined, and that every day the story can change radically.
Thank you, Judy. Well, Jeff promised you a constitutional conversation, so we'd like to speak for a few minutes on stage, but then we want to get to your very good questions. I've read through them already. If I can just quickly ask the audience, how many of you have seen the Disunion blog online? That's a pretty good sampling. How many of you read the New York Times online every day? And how many of you read the Times online and the print paper? Both. I'm still in that in-between zone.
Old people.
And how about just the print version? Okay, because these were fundamental questions for us as we were planning the blog. And does the fact that we are writing online change the way in which we are writing? And I think it did in subtle ways, but we can maybe get into that in conversation. Well, as Jeff said, we are at the NCC, and therefore I think we should look for a moment at the constitutional ramifications of the Civil War. And throughout the war, of course, the Constitution is being tested and bent and violated and studied with great care, including by the President of the United States, who in many ways rises to national prominence with his Cooper Union speech, which is a very close examination of the question of what the founders thought about this vexing question of slavery. And we have a question from Jim of Mays Landing, New Jersey. Goes right to the heart of a question Lincoln was thinking a lot about in 1860 and 61. A constitutional issue that is rarely discussed is the right of states to secede. Did South Carolina and the other states act within their rights or violate the Constitution? Sean, can you take a whack at that one?
They violated the Constitution. But hold on, I'll explain why I said that. The question of secession, Ted, goes back well before 1860, 61. New Englanders were talking about seceding as early as 1803, 1804, because they didn't like these Jeffersonians and these slaveholders and these Jacobins, as they called them. That didn't get very far, but still they were talking about it. In 1832-33, John C. Calhoun raised the issue of nullification, or rather the state of South Carolina did, over the tariff, which has misled a lot of people thinking the Civil War was about the tariff, which it was not. You didn't see too many people just dying to say, I want a low tariff, and willing to die for it. No, it didn't happen.
The Tea Party would.
You know, I'm not even sure they would have gone that far. So the question of secession, though, President Andrew Jackson, when he crushed the nullification movement in 1832-33, made a proclamation, delivered a proclamation, which really squelched the idea of secession as having any constitutional standing whatsoever. The idea that of state sovereignty, that the Constitution of the United States, the nation that is formed with the Constitution of the United States, is simply a group of states put together, you know, and they can come in or out as they want to. He said the government of the United States is a government, not a league, a government. So when the South Carolinians finally went ahead and, you know, seceded in 1861 on the basis of a perfectly democratic and constitutional election, by the way, and what they were objecting to was the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? Lincoln turned to Jackson, among others, to declare secession, the essence of anarchy, he called it. And it really goes to the heart of what the Constitution was all about and what the Union was all about. And the Union actually precedes the Constitution, for one thing. But there is a nation and there are states. And the Constitution is about the nation, and you cannot secede from the nation. The nation exists. That was later, you know, don't talk about secession now because the Supreme Court case took care of all that in Texas v. White. So it's not even a problem. But in 1860, 61, look, the Confederates didn't think that they were violating the Constitution, but then again, they were making war against the country whose Constitution they had been under. So it's kind of hard to say that they think of secession as a constitutional action.
Adam, do you
Yeah,
want
if I could chime in. It's interesting that literally as the dead and wounded were lying on the field at Gettysburg, America was celebrating the 4th of July, was celebrating Independence Day, the day after the fighting ended. And when I say America, it wasn't just the North. Surprisingly, Southerners were also, if you look in the newspapers, firing off fireworks and salutes and ringing bells for the holiday. Because throughout the Civil War, although less and less, I think, as the war went on, both sides claimed that legacy of the Founding Fathers. And in fact, when I was looking through those newspapers, I found a quotation that I think cuts to the heart of this question from a Georgia newspaper on that July 4th, 1863. They didn't yet know about the news at Gettysburg. But this editor wrote, "Our ancestors fought for self-government," by which he meant the revolutionaries. "We fight for the same sacred right." And that's something that you even hear today from some neo-Confederates making that argument for the legal right of secession. But I think it's important to say what was different about 1776 and 1861. And that is, of course, in 1776, those men who met and represented their colonies just down the block from here at Independence Hall, they were part of no voluntary political compact, no constitutional compact with the mother country of England. They weren't part of the English parliamentary system. In fact, their entire grievance was that this was a case of taxation and legislation without representation. So they really weren't seceding from anything. They were rebelling against an empire. There was no compact for them to rebel against. Whereas in 1861, of course, as Sean Wilentz just pointed out, there was a compact that they had been part of since the at least 1780s.
With this blog, we really wanted to try to tell the story in some new ways. And just about everyone loves Abraham Lincoln. He's the most beloved figure in our history. And if he wasn't before 2012, he certainly is now after Daniel Day-Lewis. But there is a kind of tyranny, and I'm not a neo-Confederate, but there's a kind of tyranny to the story. He just looks so good. His speeches are so beautiful. Lincoln is at the center of the story from beginning to end. And one of the great Lincoln speeches was given around the corner as he was coming in to become president in February 1860, when he gave a great speech at Independence Hall, sort of outlining why we had to get ready for this conflict. But we remained a constitutional society throughout the war, and the Supreme Court is functioning and making decisions, and Congress is functioning. And what do you think about the performance of the U.S. government as an integrated whole throughout the conflict? Sean, you did a piece on
The U.S.
Congress.
government, yeah. Well, first of all, there are neighborhoods in Charleston, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Jackson, Mississippi, in which Abraham Lincoln is not the most famous. Well, I mean, one of the remarkable things about the Confederates try to construct a government. They don't do a terribly good job, but it kind of gets through. The American government, the Union government, the United States government, the government of the United States, continues, as you said. They have elections. They have political parties. Everything happens in a political order that you might think was under tremendous stress. But I think the question that you're getting at, Ted, is that so much attention is put on Lincoln and his generals that we forget about everything else. And there were important Supreme Court decisions being made, not all of them terribly great at this point. But the Congress is really important. Remember, the Congress in 1861 rather, was a very different thing than it had been ever before because the entire South had left. Well, not quite the entire South, but most of the South, certainly the Deep South. So you had basically, Congress of the United States was a northern Congress. You can do pretty much what it wanted to do because the Republicans, they didn't have a majority, but they had close enough one to get a lot of stuff done. So they did, and they also pushed the issue of emancipation. We don't think about Congress's involvement in emancipation, but independent of Lincoln, and sometimes working hand in glove, I think, quietly. Congress does a lot to press forward the question of emancipation from the contraband slaves onward. So I think that you have to, in assessing both governments, but especially the United States, you have to look at all of these institutions and see them as working both in concert and sometimes divided against each other, producing what was eventually going to be the end of slavery and the Union victory.
If I can jump topics now, I've got a question from Scott of Voorhees, New Jersey, which, Judy, if I can throw your way. How was the media handling the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 and the months preceding the Battle of Gettysburg? So how were people of Pennsylvania or around the country getting the news of the emancipation?
Well, Pennsylvanians were very divided about the proclamation. There were very active and almost seditious Democratic newspapers operating out of Harrisburg and a couple of other places in Pennsylvania. And a couple of newspaper editors were actually arrested. And it was probably the best thing for their careers because they made such a big deal that I think they were in jail for a couple of days, and they kept talking about it for forever afterward. But there was great difference of opinion in Pennsylvania, in the newspapers about emancipation, among citizens of Pennsylvania. In the aftermath, of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black Philadelphians, Black Pennsylvanians celebrate in their churches. But in the weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation is passed, petitions come from throughout the state of Pennsylvania to Harrisburg, petitioning the state of Pennsylvania to pass a black code, which would have prohibited black migration into the state of Pennsylvania. And it starts ironically or oddly from like the northernmost reaches of Pennsylvania, Clearfield County, some of those counties as far north in Pennsylvania as you can possibly go, start to petition Harrisburg to say, if this Emancipation Proclamation is going to be a real thing, then we need a law in Pennsylvania to stop blacks from coming into the state. And this is coming from, someplace that's probably never seen a person of color that far north in Pennsylvania, or very few. But then that starts in February. By March, April, that becomes, those petitions come from throughout the state. People are worried in Pennsylvania. Whites are worried in Pennsylvania about what emancipation is going to look like. And the House in Harrisburg passes a black code. It never passes the Senate. It never goes anywhere, but the House passes it, saying that, attempting to put in a legal infrastructure to prevent black migration into the state. And some of these petitions actually asked, of course, for what's the next thing you're going to worry about blacks moving in your neighborhood. The second thing you're going to worry about is they're going to marry your daughter. So these petitions suggested that the state also pass a law against interracial marriage. And of course, again, these things, they don't go anywhere, but it gives you some sense of what some Pennsylvanians were worried about after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued.
A person who didn't sign the card asked a very interesting question. What was the immediate reaction to the victory at Gettysburg in the North and the South? Was it viewed as the seminal event we consider it today? Has anyone read in 1863 past the battle enough to...
Oh, no.
We stopped on July 3rd.
I can talk about that a little bit, I guess. I think there was a sort of a combination, a culmination of different things that were happening at that moment that did change the course of the war. And of course, the other thing that happened that sort of twinned with the victory at Gettysburg is the victory at Vicksburg that happened the very next day on July 4th. And I think when you look back at the news coverage, you actually see Vicksburg sort of getting equal play with Gettysburg. But one thing that's really interesting to me is what's happened to the memory of Gettysburg since 1863, because I think it is a battle that the popular culture has embraced and the national imagination has embraced in a way that perhaps during the Civil War itself, except for one very notable exception, Abraham Lincoln, people didn't see the full sort of metaphorical potential of this battle at the time. Gettysburg, for a number of reasons, I think has become prominent. And one is that it's a sort of, at least in retrospect, a feel-good moment, or potentially a feel-good moment, for both the Union and the Confederacy. And this is reflected, I think, in the way that many of us were taught the Battle of Gettysburg in high school. We're taught that it was both the moment when the North was saved from the Southern invasion, and that it was the so-called high water mark of the Confederacy, this glorious last hurrah, General Pickett's troops charging up the hill into, if not victory, at least immortality.
Not so immortal.
That's a kind of immortality. Right. But it's something that becomes important after the war as the North and South attempt, especially white Northerners and white Southerners at least, try to bind up these old wounds and divisions and find these feel-good moments from the war. Of course, Gettysburg is also an important place because it almost immediately becomes a tourist spot, especially for Northerners. Unlike the other Civil War battlefields that were in Confederate territory and often very inaccessible, Gettysburg is right there in the North. It's on rail lines. So almost immediately people are going there, picking up souvenirs from the battlefield, building monuments, of course, that incredible sort of forest of granite and marble you see out there today. So I think as important and as interesting as what happens immediately after the battle is what happens since. Of course, there's one very sort of tragically ironic moment in 1913, the 50th anniversary of the battle, when African-American Civil War veterans are banned from attending the commemoration and the reunion to which both white Unionists and white Confederate veterans are invited. So a symbol of how African-Americans were written out of so much Civil War history.
Can I add one thing about Gettysburg?
Yes.
Photography. Battle of Antietam and then Gettysburg, Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, they begin to photograph the battlefields. And they bring them back, and they go to Brady's gallery and then Gardner's gallery in Washington, D.C., and they display them. And Americans can see the horror of war as they've never seen it before. And that has a tremendous impact on people's understanding of the war at the time and our own understanding of the war. I mean, how many of us remember that there's a photograph from Gettysburg called Harvest of Death? And you've all seen it, and it's part of our imaginary about the Civil War. But that was a very new, talk about new media, a new technique that was coming into play, and the Civil War did more to introduce Americans to photography than anything else.
There are not one, but two amazing shows in New York at the moment, a show on Civil War photography at the Met, and literally around the corner within the Met, the art, the painting of the Civil War. So if you are in Manhattan this summer, I commend those two shows. We have a wonderfully terse question, probably from a Twitter addict. In fact, considerably short of 140 characters. The question is, Copperheads, question mark? And let me embellish it by, you heard the word Valendine. We had a spirited conversation before the panel about how to pronounce that word.
Valendi.
And then we realized we're the only 4 people who cared how you pronounce it. But Sean, can you tell us briefly the story of Clement, what's his name?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the story of Copperhead. There's a great deal of restiveness in the North about slavery, about secession, about the Union cause, mostly Democrats. Vallandigham was an Ohio man who was particularly vicious and made a reputation for this. And he gave that speech that I mentioned. And he does get arrested and does, in fact, get imprisoned supposedly for the duration of the war. Lincoln is wise enough to see that they're making a martyr out of him. And he changes the sentence. He's basically expelled. And then he comes around, actually, comes back out to Canada, and he runs for governor from Canada. He got the Democratic nomination. That tells you something about the Democratic Party in those days. And he could have won, except then the Union Army started doing better, so he lost. But Copperhead, there's a new movie coming out called Copperhead, which may be I have not seen this movie. No one has seen this movie. I can already say it may be the worst film ever made about the Civil War.
Do you think, speaking of movies, was Abraham Lincoln a vampire hunter?
Yeah, right. Hey, look, I'll speak personally. I don't know. Any movie that makes the slave-holding South into a bunch of ghouls can't be all bad.
Here's back to Gettysburg. Bob Bond of Wynwood, Pennsylvania asks, what was Lee's ultimate objective in this invasion of the North? Do we know? Was he trying to circle back and take Washington? Judy?
Well, he certainly wanted to take some pressure off of Virginia. He wanted to, he wanted to take some pressure off the Southern civilians. I mean, that's certainly part of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see also a lot of talk among the Southern generals and among the Southern public of let's make them feel the sting of war in the North the way that we're feeling it in the South.
Right.
And I think there was that feeling of once they actually suffer up there, it doesn't really, I think the military objectives, the strategic objectives didn't matter so much because they knew they couldn't really hold Philadelphia, they couldn't hold Harrisburg, they might not have even been able to hold Washington, but they knew that if they could make some pain felt, that might accomplish some important propaganda objectives.
Maybe turn an election.
Inflicting pain on the civilian population in the way that they later criticized William Sherman for the same thing in the South?
Well, not that. No. Well, it wasn't quite March to the Sea. But they
did talk about burning cities, and I mean, they did say if we could burn Harrisburg or we could burn Philadelphia. They talked about that earlier.
And they went to a couple of Pennsylvania towns, and they actually threatened to burn them if they didn't turn over the African Americans they were hiding. I mean, it's shades of the Nazis in Eastern Europe.
So.
And imagine if the South had managed to hold out until the middle of July, and then that city 150 miles north of here explodes. Then you have a major problem on your hands if you're Abraham Lincoln, because the draft riots break out in New York. Indeed, the draft riots were quelled by sending troops from Gettysburg to New York to try and put them down because the local militia couldn't handle it. But imagine if that hadn't gone that way. And imagine that explosion occurred in the great northern metropolis, and the South happens to be, Robert E. Lee is still in Pennsylvania. Then the pressure, which I really think what Lee was really trying to do, was to break northern morale. To feed off their crops for once, to make them, take pressure off the South in many ways, but also just to break a northern morale. That was what the South had to do. As Ted said, it wasn't about conquering, it wasn't about winning the war, right? It was about breaking northern morale. And you have to think that they could have come quite close. They could have come quite close.
This is related. It's from Alex Foxwell of Chestertown, Maryland, where Adam and I have both lived. What were the economic ramifications of the invasion of Pennsylvania, and how did that affect living conditions? Judy, you may be closest to this with your study of Emily.
Well, certainly for those Pennsylvanians who stood in the direct sort of line that Lee's army, sort of in the way of Lee's army, this would have incredible, many years effect on those communities. Gettysburg, residents of Gettysburg were cleaning up, were desperately trying to clean up as Lincoln's train was coming in November to give the speech to sort of, remove the last coffins that had not yet been reinterred at the National Cemetery, and to redig wells, to get roads working again. So for Adams County, Gettysburg residents, this was going to be a really long recovery. Chambersburg is another one of those towns. Chambersburg gets burned 3 times during the war, if I count them right. Is that right? Yeah, I think 3 times. And they will harbor deep frustrations with the Lincoln administration for selling them out, sort of leaving them as sort of a breaking point for the Confederate Army once they got burned for the 3rd time. So, I mean, a town like Chambersburg, not a really big town, but the effects of that that 3rd burning was, where the people were still rebuilding from the last when they got the last one. What else about? I don't know if there's a lot of other sort of economic ramifications, larger ramifications in Pennsylvania for the invasion. I don't know, other than those people who were sort of directly affected.
Well, there were a lot of interesting things going on in Pennsylvania economically in general during the Civil War. And it's, again, as Sean pointed out, there were lots of interesting things happening in the war that weren't happening on the battlefields and that weren't happening in Lincoln's White House. And one of the things that was going on in Pennsylvania was this enormous oil boom that's happening during the war. It was really sort of the growth of the Rockefeller fortune, the growth of much of the post-war industry. And there's an amazing painting that's in the Smithsonian, I think it's part of the show that Ted just mentioned at the Met on loan.
It is.
And it's a painting of a burning oil well in Pennsylvania. And it was painted in 1861 or 62, I think. And it's basically a pillar of fire shooting into the sky. And you look at it, and it's, of course, several things at once. It's this burning oil well. It's a symbol of this new American industry. And, of course, it's the pillar of fire, perhaps, that was leading the Israelites to freedom. So this new war for freedom that was being fought. So all these things were coming together.
And then there's those after shots of the oil fields and just the sort of incredible environmental degradation that occurs in those communities. And you'd also sort of add to that not only oil, but the lumber industry. There's sort of whole counties in north central Pennsylvania that are deforested during the war.
There are photographs in the photography show of photographers with great pride took pictures of the trestles, of the incredible wooden constructions of bridges to get trains across valleys. And they were incredible in their own right. But then behind them, you look at the hills, and they're denuded of trees. Yeah. It was like a plague of locusts was also coming along behind the armies and destroying foliage.
It bears mentioning, too, far be it from me to ever say anything nice about the Confederates, but there are accounts of the Confederates very scrupulously paying for things that they were taking from these merchants and farmers in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, they paid with Confederate currency, so you sort of picture these, well, and what do I do with this?
Yeah, there's actually in your newspaper, somebody says that in one of the newspaper accounts. They said the Confederates are showing up, but they're paying for things in Confederate script.
Well, I just got a sign that was kind of like this, which meant either it's time to do some vampire hunting or we're at the end of our program. But I want to thank you all so much for coming out and these very good questions. And let's all thank Jeff Rosen, the new president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. And please thank my fellow panelists.
See you downstairs.